The fluorescent lights hummed their ceaseless mechanical song as Rachel Torres moved through the corridors of St. Michael's Hospital like a ghost passing through rooms that didn't quite see her. 3 years of temporary nursing credentials meant she occupied a space between belonging and erasure, present enough to answer call lights, invisible enough that most permanent staff never learned her last name. She adjusted her scrubs in the locker room, the antiseptic smell sharp in her nostrils, and touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining with 2 fingers. The fabric was worn soft from years of living against her skin, the embroidered insignia barely legible now. That patch was all that remained. Everything else had been deleted. Her reflection in the scratched metal locker door showed a woman of 42 with steady eyes and scars along her forearms, thin white lines she told curious patients came from a car accident when she was 19. The lie had become automatic, easier than the truth. Nobody asked follow-up questions after that. The cold steel of her locker clicked shut with a sound like a rifle bolt, and she turned toward the ICU corridor. Her hands were steady as she moved. They always were. Hands that had held wounds together in sandstorms didn't tremble at the sight of a difficult for start or a patient in crisis. Muscle memory ran deeper than the temporary ID badge clipped to her pocket. The ICU smelled like every hospital in America, disinfectant layered over something organic underneath, something that no amount of bleach could erase. Rachel checked the assignment board, committing the patient names to memory the way she'd been trained. Room for 12, Mr. Chen, post-op cardiac. Room for 15, Mrs. Okonkwo, pneumonia, day 4. Room for 18, Admiral Vincent Hartley, admitted 2 hours ago through emergency, acute cardiac observation. She felt something shift in her chest when she read the Admiral's name. Vincent Hartley. The man who commanded her son's destroyer group. The man her son had saluted every morning for 2 years before she lost contact with her son entirely. Before everything became classified and unspeakable. She pushed the feeling down the way she'd learned to push things down, methodically, completely, as if emotions were vital signs that needed to be recorded and filed away in a locked cabinet. Admiration for Admiral Hartley was a luxury she couldn't afford. He had no idea who she was. Nobody did anymore. Rachel entered Mr. Chen's room first, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. His oxygen saturation sat at 94%, his heart rate steady at 76. Good. Stable. She adjusted his for flow, her fingers moving with the terrifying fluid precision that came from having saved lives under conditions most nurses would consider impossible. The old man's eyes opened. He watched her work for a moment, then smiled. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. "Many times," Rachel replied. She kept her voice soft, deferential, the voice of someone with no credentials worth defending. "Try to rest, Mr. Chen. Your heart's doing well." She documented her findings and moved to the next room. In the hallway, she passed Dr. Mercer reviewing the patient board, his expensive pen poised over the notes like a weapon. He was tall, maybe 55, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. His white coat was pristine. His shoes looked custom-made. His presence made the air pressure change, the way a predator's entrance altered the composition of a room. His eyes tracked her as she moved, and she felt the weight of his gaze the way she'd learned to feel the weight of a scope sight through a window. Recognition of a threat. Assessment. Calculation. He was observing her? She understood this without him saying anything. She understood that he saw a temporary nurse moving through his hospital with too much authority in her hands, earning nods from patients despite her lack of permanent status, and he didn't like it. Status in a hospital wasn't earned through competence, it was inherited through credentials and connections. Rachel's hands moved like they belonged to someone who had trained for combat medicine in a war zone, and Dr. Mercer saw that. He saw the precision. He saw that patients trusted her in ways they didn't trust other nurses. He saw a threat to the hierarchy he'd built. Rachel's hands trembled. No. Wait. They didn't. That was the point. Her hands never trembled. Not in the break room. Not under observation. Not ever. She continued toward Admiral Hartley's room. The ICU was filling with the sound of afternoon shift change, overhead paging in clipped medical shorthand, the beeping of a dozen heart monitors, the squeak of a stretcher wheels being pushed toward radiology. The Admiral was sitting up in bed when she entered, his color better than the admit notes had suggested. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and they focused on her with the sharp intelligence of someone used to reading situations in seconds. He'd been a commanding officer. He knew how to evaluate people. "Admiral Hartley, I'm Rachel Torres. I'll be your nurse this afternoon." She kept her voice level, professional, betraying nothing of the fact that she knew who he was, what he commanded, how many sailors worked under his orders. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I expected," he said. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, powerful but controlled, held in reserve. "They said it's precautionary. ECG was normal. Blood work came back clean." He paused, studying her. "You move like someone used to high-pressure situations." Rachel's jaw clenched slightly. She turned to the monitors without breaking rhythm. "I've worked in several busy hospitals. You learn to move efficiently." It was technically true. The busiest hospital she'd ever worked in had been the field clinic at Bagram, where efficient movement meant people lived. "No, that's not what I mean," the Admiral said. His eye stayed on her. "You move like someone who's been trained. Like someone military." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the next bed wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Rachel's hands continued their work, checking his verifying his medications against the chart, confirming his pain level. She didn't flinch. She didn't meet his eyes again. "Nursing school was rigorous," she said. "That's all." The Admiral nodded slowly, and she felt the moment he decided to let it go. A commander's courtesy. He had recognized something in her, the bearing, the composure, the way she carried herself, and he'd given her the choice to confirm or deny it. Rachel made a mental note to request a different patient assignment. Working under Admiral Hartley's observation was a risk she couldn't afford. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later, his presence entering the room before his body did. He held a folder in one hand and wore the expression of someone about to deliver bad news with satisfaction. "Torres," he said, and the way he said her name suggested it tasted bad in his mouth. A word in the hallway. Rachel finished documenting Admiral Hartley's vitals and excused herself. In the corridor, Dr. Mercer closed the door behind them with the precision of a man who wanted privacy for what he was about to do. Other nurses were beginning their afternoon assignments, moving between rooms, but something in Dr. Mercer's posture made them look away. Nobody wanted to be nearby when Dr. Mercer was about to correct someone. "I've been reviewing your care notes," he said, opening the folder. "Your charting on Mrs. Okonkwo shows you adjusted her oxygen delivery without consulting me first." "Her saturation was dropping," Rachel said. Her voice remained even, professional. "Room air to 2 liters nasal cannula is a standard intervention. It's also a medication adjustment that requires physician approval." He turned a page with the precision of a scalpel. "You have limited training, Ms. Torres. Temporary credentials. At this hospital, we follow a chain of command. Your job is to observe and report, not to make clinical decisions." Rachel said nothing. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only gave people more material to use against her. "I'm going to be watching your work more closely," Dr. Mercer continued. "I think it's important for patient safety. Don't you agree?" "Yes, Doctor," Rachel said quietly. He walked away, and she stood in the hallway, feeling the weight of being watched settle onto her shoulders like a familiar coat. She'd worn that weight before. She knew how to move under it. She knew how to breathe normally while something inside her was calculating angles and exits. The fluorescent lights hummed. A monitor beeped. A code alert crackled over the intercom from the emergency department. Somewhere in this hospital, people were fighting for someone's life. Rachel returned to the ICU and checked on her remaining patients. She documented everything perfectly. She followed every protocol. She moved through the afternoon like she had been trained to move, efficiently, invisibly, earning the trust of patients while gathering the silence of colleagues like a cloak. When she entered the break room at 3:33 p.m. for her scheduled break, 5 nurses who had been sitting there peacefully stood up almost simultaneously. They collected their lunches, their phones, their half-empty coffee cups, and filed out without making eye contact with her. The coordination was too smooth to be accidental. The timing too perfect. Dr. Mercer had made a phone call, or maybe just a comment. That's all it took. Hospitals ran on social currency, and he'd spent his on making sure everyone understood that Rachel Torres was not one of them. She sat alone in the break room, ate a sandwich she wasn't hungry for, and stared at the wall where someone had taped a flyer about the hospital's upcoming charity gala. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before another thought arrived. Then the realization, this was stage 1. She'd seen this pattern before in other hospitals, other jobs, other places where she didn't fit. It always progressed. It always accelerated. It always ended the same way, with her moving on to the next temporary assignment, the next hospital, the next city where nobody knew her name, where she could help people while remaining invisible to them. Except this time she was caring for Admiral Vincent Hartley, the man who commanded her son's carrier group. This time the stakes felt different, even though she knew better than to let stakes feel like anything at all. When Rachel returned to the unit at 4:15 p.m., there was a new document posted on the unit board, printed in red ink on white paper. The title read, Nursing Care Deviation Report. Her name was listed under patient and incident. The allegations were minor, protocol deviations, questionable clinical decision-making, lack of coordination with physician staff, but they were documented, official, and visible to every staff member who passed the board. Dr. Mercer had printed 3 copies. He'd left them where they couldn't be missed. Rachel read the document once, committing the exact wording to memory. Her expression didn't change. Her hands didn't tremble. Inside, something that had been sleeping for 3 years began to stir, but she kept it locked down. She had survived worse than a write-up from a doctor with something to prove. She had survived things that would have broken most people. She could survive this too. She removed one of the copies from the board and filed it in Admiral Hartley's chart, ensuring the documentation was accurate and traceable. If Dr. Mercer wanted to play by the rules, she would play by the rules. She would document everything perfectly. She would follow every protocol. She would be invisible and efficient and professional until the moment when being invisible was no longer an option. The evening shift began at 5 o'clock. Rachel prepared her patients for night, checking vitals one final time, ensuring comfort measures were in place, making notes for the night nurse. Admiral Hartley watched her work with that same intelligent focus he'd shown earlier. He didn't comment on the write-up, which meant he'd seen it. He didn't ask questions, which meant he'd understood what it meant. He simply nodded once when she told him she was finishing her shift, a commander's acknowledgment to someone he recognized as someone trained in command. Rachel clocked out at 5:33 p.m. and walked to her car in the parking lot. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause. She sat in her vehicle for exactly 3 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing normally. The faded unit patch was still inside her jacket, still sewn against her skin, still the only proof that she had ever been anything more than temporary. The next morning arrived with the kind of silence that precedes everything breaking. Rachel stood in Admiral Hartley's room at 6:45, the hospital still half asleep, the hallways empty except for the soft hiss of ventilators and the distant beeping of monitors maintaining lives through the dark hours. The Admiral's daughter Jennifer sat in the vinyl chair, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, a coffee cup growing cold on the windowsill. Rachel moved through her medication round with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, blood pressure cuff, pulse ox, the gentle efficiency of hands that knew their purpose. The door opened without warning. Dr. Mercer entered, his white coat immaculate, his stethoscope draped like a medal of authority around his neck. He didn't greet anyone. He lifted the medication chart from the foot of the bed and scanned it with the expression of a man examining something beneath his station. His eyes found Rachel. Miss Torres, he said, emphasizing the word miss the way a critic emphasizes a typo, perhaps you could explain to me, and to our patient's family, why you're administering 4 milligrams of morphine when the standard protocol calls for 2. Rachel didn't flinch. She met his gaze directly, her voice steady. The Admiral's pain threshold indicates. Your limited training makes you dangerous. Mercer's voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He turned to Jennifer, his smile carefully constructed. High-value patients require experienced staff. I'll be adjusting all dosages personally going forward. He made a note on the chart with the flourish of someone signing a death warrant. Jennifer shifted in her chair, the vinyl creaking under her discomfort. She looked at Rachel, then at Mercer, uncertainty flickering across her face like a fault line. Admiral Hartley's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Protocol, Rachel understood. Don't make the doctor's day worse. Don't risk anything. Rachel took one measured breath. Her hands remained steady, her posture unchanged, her face composed as stone. Then she felt it, a single tear, warm against her cheek, tracing a path downward with its own gravity. She let it happen. She didn't fight it. And she didn't look away. She reached up and wiped the tear away with the back of her hand, her eyes never leaving Mercer's. I've treated sucking chest wounds in Bagram while you were perfecting your handwriting, Doctor. The words hung in the room like a held breath. Mercer's smile didn't waver, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed to the width of a knife blade. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and left without another word. The door swung shut behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss. Admiral Hartley stared at her. Jennifer stared at her. Rachel finished checking his vitals, documented everything in the chart with her neat, consistent handwriting, and left the room without explanation. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and regret when Rachel entered at lunch. She'd been working at St. Michael's for 4 weeks. In that time, she'd come to recognize the break room rhythms. Sandra always microwaved her container of chicken breast at 12:15. Tom usually brought a sandwich from his wife. The residence table in the corner was always loud and always a study in hierarchy. Rachel sat down with her tray at a table near the window, her lunch deliberately modest, a salad, water, nothing that would draw attention. Within 30 seconds, Sandra stood. She gathered her plastic container without looking at Rachel, her movements deliberate and final. She relocated to the opposite end of the room. Then Tom. Then the 2 PRNs who usually read on their phones. Then the respiratory therapist who sometimes smiled in the hallway. Within 2 minutes, Rachel sat alone in the center of a suddenly empty section of table, surrounded by abandoned chairs and the ghost presence of people who had just decided she didn't exist. She ate slowly. Methodically. She didn't look up. She didn't look around. She didn't acknowledge what had happened. Her composure was an armor of absolute stillness, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, from having been erased once before. She finished her salad. She drank her water. She stood, carried her tray to the dishwasher, and walked back to work without a word. The public humiliation came at shift change, when exhaustion and impatience made people careless about cruelty. Dr. Mercer stood at the nurse's station with a clipboard, his voice carrying across the unit like an announcement system. A formal write-up had been posted on the unit board, the header printed in red ink, thick, aggressive, unavoidable, persistent protocol deviations, Torres. He read the charges aloud. Unauthorized medication adjustments. Failure to consult attending physician. Inadequate assessment documentation. His voice was measured, precise, the voice of a man building a case. Temporary staff who cannot follow basic procedures endanger everyone on this unit. Endangering patients is unacceptable. This is a formal notation. 12 staff members stood within hearing distance. Maybe more. Rachel stood perfectly still, listening to her professional competence being dismantled point by point, listening to her temporary status being weaponized as evidence of her fundamental inadequacy. She didn't defend herself. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. Her face remained composed, her shoulders level, her breathing unchanged. Then she turned and walked to her next patient's room without a word. And that's when the real nightmare began. That evening, Admiral Hartley's room had a new nurse. Rachel discovered the change when she arrived for her rounds. Her assignment sheet had been altered. The Admiral transferred to Margaret, a senior RN with 15 years of tenure and a comfort level with institutional power that Rachel could never claim. Rachel's new assignments took her to the far end of the medical surgical wing, the furthest point from the main station, the most junior cases, post-op appendectomies and 2 patients in observation. The Admiral's chart, when she tried to access it that afternoon, now required supervisor approval to view. Dr. Mercer's email had arrived at 3:20 in the afternoon, time-stamped and carbon-copied to the Director of Nursing, the Quality Assurance Officer, and the Chief Medical Administrator. I have concerns regarding the clinical judgment and credentials of temporary nursing staff assigned to high-acuity patients. Recommend immediate verification of educational background and clinical competency. Current assignments may represent a liability exposure. It was elegant. It was systematic. It was the kind of attack that felt like procedure rather than malice. By 6 o'clock, Rachel had been reassigned twice more. By the end of the shift, Dr. Mercer had made 3 phone calls from his office. She heard this from Tom, who had heard it from Sandra, who felt comfortable sharing information with someone Mercer was dismantling. The calls, Tom said quietly, were to the charge nurse, to nursing administration, and to someone Tom didn't recognize but described as sounding official. Rachel sat in her vehicle in the parking lot, hands on the steering wheel, her breathing steady and controlled. The Colorado Springs evening was warm, the sky that particular shade of blue that only happens at mile-high elevation. She could see the medical center sign from here, the helicopter landing pad illuminated against the darkening sky, the small human dramas playing out behind lit windows that she was no longer permitted to witness. She reached inside her jacket and felt the faded unit patch sewn against her skin, still there, still hidden, still the only physical evidence that she had ever worn anything besides these scrubs. The patch felt like a promise. It also felt like a noose. She started the engine and drove home through the Colorado darkness, knowing that tomorrow would bring another version of this, another small erasure, another tactical repositioning, another reminder that temporary people have no institutional rights, no protection, no voice. Dr. Mercer was professional about it. He was methodical. He was using the machinery of hospital bureaucracy the way someone uses a scalpel, with precision, with authority, with the absolute certainty that he would never be questioned. Rachel had experienced institutional power before. She had seen what it looked like when an organization decided you didn't belong. She had survived it once. She wasn't sure she could survive it twice. The 3:56 a.m. hallway runs like a rifle range, fluorescent lights casting parallel shadows along the polished concrete. Rachel passes Admiral Hartley's room and slows her pace without stopping, her eyes catching what her training has already logged, the rise and fall of his chest pulling harder than it should, each breath requiring the effort that means something underneath isn't working the way it's supposed to. His oxygen saturation was 94% this morning. The chart said he was stable. The chart was written by a man who walked into hospital rooms like he was reviewing a wine list. She continues down the corridor, her shoes whispering against the floor, every muscle trained to process information without broadcasting it. 16 years since Bagram. 16 years since she learned that the best assessment happens when nobody knows you're assessing. Dr. Mercer is inside the Admiral's room when Rachel approaches the nurse's station, clipboard in hand, tablet tucked under his arm like a general with dispatch papers. Through the window, she watches him perform the examination, 30 seconds of stethoscope placement, a cursory percussion of the chest, not even looking at the Admiral's face. Mercer types something into his tablet, his movements conveying what his expression already broadcasts, a man who has seen enough, heard enough, decided enough. He's finished before the Admiral finishes a sentence. Rachel approaches the charge nurse, Maria, who's organizing evening medication rounds with the deliberate efficiency of someone who understands consequences. Admiral Hartley's breathing pattern has changed since yesterday, Rachel says, her voice level and clinical. His respiratory rate is elevated, and he's compensating. I think he needs a chest X-ray. His rib fracture could be. You're not assigned to that patient, Maria cuts her off, not unkindly but with the finality of someone reading from a script that was handed to her before shift. Dr. Mercer has it handled. Rachel says nothing. She watches through the glass as Mercer adjusts the oxygen from 2 liters to 4, makes a note, and leaves without checking the Admiral's breathing one more time. The subtle signs of pneumothorax don't announce themselves like cardiac arrest. They whisper. They ask questions. They require a clinician who's spent time in trauma bays where the quiet patients are the ones who die first. That afternoon, the Admiral is sitting up in bed, reading glasses on, studying a worn copy of Sun Tzu. He looks up as Rachel enters for the evening vital signs, a routine task that's been carefully reassigned and then reassigned back when other staff needed the coverage. His eyes track her with the focused intensity of someone trained to read personnel files, assess character, recognize the presence of skills that don't match the uniform. "You know my commanding officer?" he asks, not a question but a statement. Rachel clips the blood pressure cuff to his arm, her movements precise and practiced. "Your son's destroyer group, sir. He mentioned it when you were admitted." "That's not what I asked." The Admiral's voice carries the weight of someone accustomed to having questions answered directly. "Mercer avoided this room 3 times yesterday. Minimum exam time. Minimum eye contact. That's not how you treat a 3-star Admiral unless you're making a point." He pauses, watching her face. "But you came in here like you were assessing a casualty. Which means you've done it before. Multiple times. Under pressure." Rachel focuses on the blood pressure monitor, the numbers climbing, 132/87. "My job is to." "Your job is survival," Hartley interrupts, and his voice drops into something that sounds like command authority. "I've seen that posture before. Combat medical training. Field conditions. I want to know if I need to be concerned about my medical care or if you're solid enough to stand watch." The cuff releases with a soft hiss. Rachel doesn't look away. "You're stable, sir. Vitals are consistent." "You didn't answer the question." "No, sir. I didn't." The Admiral nods once, the kind of nod that means he's registered the answer anyway. In the silence that follows, Rachel can hear the cardiac monitor in the adjacent room, the low hum of the ventilator 3 doors down, the distant percussion of a helicopter rotor, medevac inbound from somewhere, the sound of emergency arriving like clockwork. When Rachel checks the electronic health record 2 hours later, she discovers that Dr. Mercer has restricted her access to Admiral Hartley's medication administration record and imaging results. The notification appears in red text, "Access limited pending protocol review." His justification, filed in the system notes, cites scope of practice concerns and the appropriate supervision requirements for temporary staff. The timing is surgical. The intention is transparent. By the next morning, he's reassigned all of Hartley's medication rounds to Patricia, one of the permanent nurses whose compliance with his directives has never wavered. Rachel passes Patricia in the supply room and says nothing. There's nothing to say. Mercer has made his move with the same methodical precision he's deployed throughout the past weeks, each action documented, each decision defensible, each step building a case that has nothing to do with patient safety and everything to do with eliminating a variable he cannot control. The certified letter arrives at Rachel's apartment on a Thursday evening, the official letterhead of the Colorado State Board of Nursing printed across the top in authoritative serif type. They're requesting documentation of her training credentials, her employment history, her references, all within 14 business days. A routine inquiry, they claim. Necessary verification for a temp nurse working within state jurisdiction. Standard procedure, nothing to be concerned about. Rachel reads the letter 3 times, sitting on her kitchen floor in the dark, understanding with absolute clarity what Mercer has triggered. She cannot provide her naval training records because they don't exist in any civilian database. She cannot list her commanding officers as references because those names are classified. She cannot produce her military service credentials because Captain Rachel Torres's record was officially terminated when Operation Crosswind was buried. The arrays don't come with paper trails. They come with silence and the understanding that surfacing, even to defend yourself, could mean federal prosecution. The walls don't close in all at once. They move with the steady pressure of a hydraulic press, slow enough that you might convince yourself it's not happening until you try to move and discover your shoulders are already pinned. Rachel has survived worse. She's held tourniquets in place while Chinooks roared overhead. She's sewn wounds under fire. She's walked through Kandahar with 17 rounds left and a medic who was barely coherent from blood loss. She survived it once. She has no idea how to survive it twice. The next afternoon, Dr. Mercer passes her in the hallway outside the supply room, his expression composed and neutral. His eyes don't acknowledge her directly, but his presence carries something underneath the surface, a satisfaction so complete it almost qualifies as respect. He's executed his strategy with precision. He's used the hospital's own systems as weapons. He's made her disappear without ever having to raise his voice. Rachel continues reorganizing the 4-pump inventory, counting boxes of tubing, each motion the muscle memory of someone compartmentalizing. She pulls out 8 central line kits from the supply shelf, stacks them with the careful deliberation of someone who needs to do something with her hands that isn't throwing something. "You're doing great work," one of the new residents says, passing by with a pile of charts. "Don't let the politics get to you." Rachel doesn't look up. She doesn't smile. She places the last kit precisely where it belongs and says, "Politics is just another name for who has power and who doesn't." The code alarm screamed at 2:24 a.m. from the cardiac wing. Rachel heard it 3 corridors away, a sound like a predator's cry that every nurse in the hospital recognized as imminent death. She was in the supply closet on floor 3, restocking medication kits with the methodical precision of someone who had nothing left to lose, when the overhead intercom crackled, "Code blue, room for 12. Code blue, room for 12. Admiral Hartley's room." She moved before thinking, her body responding to muscle memory older and deeper than any job title. Her feet found the hallway. Running. The unit secretary was frozen at the desk, phone halfway to her ear. A young LPN named Marcus stood in the Admiral's doorway, mouth open, useless. Rachel pushed past him into a room that had become a house of horrors in 12 seconds. The Admiral lay on his back, his chest heaving in that distinctive pattern, paradoxical breathing, one side of the ribcage moving opposite the other. His lips were turning blue. His eyes locked onto hers and she read the message there, "Help me." The ventilator beside his bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the machine couldn't fix what had happened. His trachea was crushed. The undetected rib fracture from his fall 3 days ago had finally torn loose, punctured his pleural space, and now the lung was collapsing while air pressure built up like a compressed spring ready to snap. Rachel didn't wait for Dr. Mercer's assessment. She didn't wait for orders or permission or the validation of someone with a permanent nameplate. She moved to the crash cart with the economy of motion that came from having done this under mortar fire, the muscle memory that transcended civilian hierarchies. The 14-gauge needle was exactly where it should be. She palpated the space between the Admiral's 2nd and 3rd ribs, mid-clavicular line, her fingers reading the anatomy like braille. The skin was cool, the ribs distinct under her touch. One breath. One movement. The needle went in. The hiss of released pressure filled the room like air escaping a punctured tire, the sound of a crisis resolving in a single moment. The Admiral's chest relaxed. His lips regained color, that terrible blue fading into pink within seconds. His breathing eased. His eyes closed in relief so profound it looked like prayer. Sinus rhythm. Stable. A code reversed in 45 seconds because someone had acted while others froze. Dr. Mercer arrived 30 seconds later, moving with the unhurried precision of a man who expected his presence alone to restore order. He took in the scene, Rachel with the needle, the Admiral breathing, the gathered staff watching, the monitor showing normal vital signs. His face remained perfectly calm. It was the calmest she had ever seen him, which meant it was the most dangerous. "Everyone out," he said quietly. "Now." The room emptied. Rachel stood motionless, the needle still in her hand, and Mercer pulled her into the hallway, his grip on her elbow firm but not rough. He knew how to apply pressure without leaving marks. "You just performed a procedure outside your scope on a patient you're not assigned to," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, quiet, powerful, ready to move. "He was dying," Rachel said. The words came out steady. No apology. No explanation. Statement of fact. Mercer's jaw tightened fractionally. He was under my care. Not true. They both knew it. But truth had nothing to do with this. He released her elbow and stepped away, pulling his phone from his pocket. The first call went to the state nursing board. Rachel could hear his voice through the walls as she stood frozen in the hallway, every muscle locked in the kind of restraint that comes from having already lost everything that mattered. "I need to escalate my previous complaint to emergency status," he was saying, his tone professionally grave. "Captain Torres," he stopped. Said it differently. "Ms. Torres performed an unauthorized emergency procedure outside her credential scope on a critical patient. I'm concerned about patient safety and institutional liability." Pause. "Yes. Immediately." The second call went to hospital administration. "I'm requesting immediate termination of the temporary nurse assigned to my unit. She's a safety risk. I have documentation of protocol deviations and now an unauthorized emergency intervention." Pause. "I understand we'll need to involve risk management, but the nursing board will be investigating independently." Mercer's voice carried the absolute confidence of a man who had already won. The third call went to security. "I need an escort from the building for a staff member in my unit. It's a sensitive matter but necessary. Can someone meet me at the administrative office in 30 minutes? He hung up and looked at Rachel standing in the hallway, her hand still trembling with the adrenaline of saving a life she was never supposed to touch. "You're terminated," he said. "Security will escort you from the building. Don't make this difficult." He walked past her toward the Admiral's room without another glance, already composed, already moving on to the next patient, the next shift, the next opportunity to demonstrate that he controlled everything in his sphere. Rachel didn't move for 3 seconds. The hallway around her had returned to normal, monitors beeping in steady rhythm, ventilators whooshing, a nurse calling out vitals, the hospital pretending it hadn't just witnessed something extraordinary. Then she walked to the administrative office on the first floor, where a woman named Patricia in HR was waiting with the paperwork already printed. "I'm sorry this happened," Patricia said, and Rachel understood she actually meant it. "But Dr. Mercer's been very clear about the liability issues, and the nursing board investigation makes our position untenable." The termination form was 4 pages long. Cause, scope of practice violation with potential patient endangerment. Rachel read it with the same detachment she would use to read a mission briefing on a flight deck. All the words were technically true. All of them were incomplete. She signed the form without comment. Within 40 minutes, she had been stripped of her access badges, her locker cleared, her digital credentials revoked. Security Officer Davis, who had been kind to her every single morning for 4 months, walked her to her car in the pre-dawn darkness. He didn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said at the driver's side door. She nodded once and got in the car without speaking. 3 days later, she returned to St. Michael's during off-hours to return her final scrubs. The hospital had given her permission to do this during a minimal staff shift, a concession to her professional courtesy. She stood in the laundry room, folding each piece slowly, smoothing out every crease with hands that had once sutured wounds in a field hospital while rounds landed outside and the radio screamed for more medics. The fabric was familiar, worn soft by 100 washings. She removed her jacket, the one she'd worn as a temp, the only jacket that had survived her transition from captain to nobody, and touched the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining one final time. The emblem was barely visible anymore, the colors aged by years of classified service and deliberate erasure. Shadow 6. That was who she had been. That was who she no longer was permitted to be. The ER doors burst open with a bang that echoed through the entire hospital at 4:33 p.m. on the 4th day. Paramedics rushed in with a critical patient, a gunshot wound to the abdomen, blood loss catastrophic. Rachel heard the chaos from the break room where she'd been retrieving her personal items, the one photograph she'd hidden in the back of a cabinet, a coffee mug nobody else would want. The commotion pulled her toward the ER like a current she couldn't resist. She moved to the trauma hallway, standing in the shadows, watching through the glass of the observation window as the team mobilized. Her team. The team that was no longer hers. The patient on the stretcher locked eyes with her across the distance. His face registered shock, then recognition, then something that looked like salvation. He stopped struggling against the medical staff, stopped fighting the restraints, and his lips formed a single word. Loud enough for the Marine standing beside him, weapons holstered, tactical gear visible, to hear. Shadow 6. The Marine went absolutely rigid. The entire trauma bay froze. Doctors mid-motion. Nurses with gloved hands suspended. Everyone except Rachel, who had learned long ago how to absorb a shock and let it move through her body without changing her expression. The Afghan man's eyes locked onto Rachel's across the trauma bay, and something in his expression shifted from patient to witness. His voice emerged as a whisper, fractured and careful, Shadow 6. 2 words. Impossible words. Rachel's hand stilled over the 4 line. Shadow 6 was a call sign that existed nowhere on any document, in any file, in any record that the Pentagon had officially burned 3 years ago. The man's lips moved again. Bagram. 2019, you held me when I couldn't breathe. Rachel's composure didn't crack. It deepened. She finished threading the line with the precision of someone whose hands had performed this exact movement under fire, under darkness, under the weight of knowing that this moment, this man breathing now, was why she'd been willing to disappear. The Marine Corps liaison arrived within 57 minutes. He moved through St. Michael's like a man carrying official secrets the way some people carry weapons, and he asked for Rachel by name, not by her temp credentials, not by her ward assignment, but by her actual name. He found her in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and he handed her a leather folder, his voice low and steady. Captain Torres, I have a citation I need to read aloud. Behind him, 2 more officers in dress blues stood in the doorway. Rachel looked at the folder. She didn't open it. Go ahead, she said. The liaison cleared his throat, for exceptional valor under fire during a classified extraction operation designated Crosswind, treating 47 combat casualties in a contested zone while under active enemy fire, maintaining medical operations despite 3 rounds impacting the aid station, and preventing cascading casualties through advanced field interventions that exceeded her training specifications at the time. Citation awarded retroactively pending clearance reclassification. He paused. You saved a lot of people that day, Captain. The voice that came next belonged to Admiral Vincent Hartley, still gripping the fore-pole, still pale but moving with the careful authority of a man trained to command. He appeared in the break room doorway in his hospital gown, the fabric hanging loose over a frame that had lost 20 pounds to illness, and his voice emerged steady as a radio transmission. Everything this officer just said is accurate. Rachel Torres served under my command's operational umbrella. She was the finest medical asset we had in theater. She shouldn't have been erased. The staff who'd filed past the break room windows froze. Sandra, the veteran nurse who'd coordinated Rachel's social exile, stopped mid-step. The charge nurse who'd blocked every concern Rachel raised about Admiral Hartley's respiratory decline closed her eyes. Jennifer Hartley appeared behind the Admiral, her hand on his shoulder, steadying him. My father asked to come down here the moment he understood what was happening, she said quietly. He wanted to be present when the truth started moving. The 2-star general entered through the ER doors like the air pressure changed around him. His uniform carried decorations that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his presence moved through the hospital with the terrifying fluid precision of something apex, something that had spent decades making decisions that altered the trajectories of lives. He walked directly to Rachel, rendered a full salute, fist to chest, held for 2 seconds, and his jaw worked before he spoke. Captain, on behalf of the Department of Defense, your service record is officially reclassified from erased to distinguished. He gestured to an aide, who produced a dress uniform jacket bearing the ribbons of 4 deployments and, more importantly, 2 medals, a Navy Cross and a Purple Heart, pinned side by side, catching the fluorescent light like they'd been waiting for this moment for 1,095 days. These were earned, the general said. They were just never allowed to be worn. Rachel's eyes went to the medals. She'd forgotten the weight they carried. She'd forgotten what it meant to have survived things that came with documentation. The FBI agents moved through the hospital corridors like they were following a scent, and they found Dr. Mercer in his office, sitting behind his desk, signing off on medical records with the practiced confidence of a man who'd never once doubted his right to be there. Special Agent Brooks held up credentials. "Dr. Mercer, we need to discuss your residency at Massachusetts General Hospital." Mercer's pen paused. "I don't know what," he started, but Brooks cut him off with the precision of someone used to stopping conversations. "Your complaint to the State Nursing Board regarding Rachel Torres triggered a background verification. We found your residency was never completed. The certification you submitted is a forgery." The color drained from Mercer's face like someone had pulled a plug. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Brooks continued, "We also found that you attempted to forge additional documents yesterday to support your complaint against Torres. Digital forensics dated the signatures. They're 24 hours old." 2 more agents flanked Mercer's desk. One of them produced handcuffs. The clicking sound echoed through the office like a countdown. "You're under arrest for practicing medicine without proper credentials, fraud, and forgery." Mercer's chair rolled backward as he stood, his voice climbing. "This is insane. I've been here for 6 years. I'm board certified." Brooks shook her head. "You're board certified in a field where your foundational credentials are fabricated. That makes every certification that followed them fraudulent." The perp walk happened in silence. Mercer's hands cuffed in front of him, the metal catching the overhead lights as the agents guided him through the corridors he'd walked with such authority moments before. Every staff member in view stopped what they were doing. Sandra, the veteran nurse, covered her mouth with her hand. The charge nurse who'd coordinated Rachel's erasure stared at the ground. Nurses, residents, attending physicians, all of them watched a doctor reduced to a suspect being led past the stations where he'd given orders with absolute certainty. Jennifer Hartley stood in the Admiral's doorway, her arms crossed, her expression something between vindication and exhaustion. Admiral Hartley simply nodded, once, a commander's acknowledgment of a mission completed. Rachel stood perfectly still in the break room doorway, watching the man who'd tried to destroy her disappear into the federal system. Her composure remained absolute, her face showing nothing of the weight lifting, the erasure reversing, the silence that had surrounded her beginning to break. Agent Brooks paused beside her before leaving. His scrutiny of your credentials exposed his own fraud. The harder he pushed against you, the deeper we dug into him. He destroyed himself trying to destroy you. Rachel's only response was a slight nod, the kind of acknowledgment that said she'd already known this was how it would end. The hospital chapel was hastily converted for a ceremony that same afternoon, the afternoon light slanting through the windows at an angle that made everything look ceremonial whether it was or not. Rachel stood in dress uniform she hadn't worn in 3 years, the fabric hanging perfectly because military uniforms were designed to hang perfectly on military frames, and the Navy Cross and Purple Heart caught the light against her chest like proof of something the world had been pretending didn't exist. The general delivered remarks that moved quickly through Operation Crosswind without revealing anything classified, speaking instead about the 47 lives saved, about service that continued when the uniform came off, about the cost of disappearing so that operations could stay hidden. Hospital administrators offered formal apologies, reinstatement, back pay, and a quiet suggestion that they hoped she'd reconsider staying. Rachel declined without hesitation. "St. Michael's taught me what I needed to know about how institutions protect themselves instead of their people. I think I'm done." She paused. "But I'm taking a position at the VA hospital across town. Veterans deserve medical officers who understand what they've actually survived." Admiral Hartley approached in a wheelchair, Jennifer pushing, and he gripped Rachel's hand with the strength of someone whose body hadn't given up despite the illness claiming it. "My son Michael should know what you did here. You didn't just save my life. You reminded this place what integrity looks like. Rachel smiled for the first time in 72 hours. Tell him Shadow 6 sends her regards. The former Taliban commander, recovered enough from surgery to understand what was happening, was brought to the chapel under federal guard, a moment that held its own kind of poetry. Through a translator, his voice came slow and careful. This doctor showed mercy when she could have let me die. In Bagram, when I was bleeding, she treated me like I was human. Rachel shook his hand. The circle closed. Outside the chapel windows, a news crew filmed the final act, Dr. Mercer being loaded into a federal vehicle, his future compressing into 5 to 10 years in a minimum security facility, and if he was lucky after release, exceptionally lucky, he might find work driving a medical supply van, delivering equipment to hospitals he could no longer practice in, a permanent exile of his own making. Rachel stood at the chapel altar, her hand touching the Navy cross, then the faded unit patch she'd worn inside her jacket lining for 3 years, now properly displayed beside her decorations, finally allowed to exist in the same space as her medals. The general asked her to say a few words. She faced the assembled staff, some who'd supported her silently, many who hadn't. Her voice came steady, commanding, the voice of someone who'd stopped asking permission to speak. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The ceremony ended. Rachel walked out of St. Michael's for the final time in dress uniform, through the front doors, her head level, her step the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are. The chapel doors closed behind her, and she was done being invisible. Subscribe to see more stories of hidden strength and quiet valor, and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real story?